Extreme poverty, absolute poverty, destitution or penury, was originally defined by the United Nations in 1995 as a condition characterized by severe deprivation of basic human needs, including food, safe drinking water, sanitation facilities, health, shelter, education and information. It depends not only on income but also in access to services. Quote, in 2008, extreme poverty widely refers to earning below the international poverty line of $1.25 per day, set by the World Bank. This measure is the equivalent to earning $1 a day in 1996 U.S. prices, hence the widely used expression, living on less than $1 a day. The vast majority of those in extreme poverty, 96%, reside in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, the West Indies, East Asia and the Pacific. Nearly half live in India and China alone. The reduction of extreme poverty and hunger was the first Millennium Development Goal, as set by 189 United Nations member states in 2000. Specifically, MDG 1 set a target of reducing the extreme poverty rate in half by 2015, a goal that was met 5 years ahead of schedule. This goal was created to end poverty in all its forms everywhere, and the international community, including the UN, the World Bank and the United States, has set a target of ending extreme poverty by 2030. Defining extreme poverty. Income-based definition. Extreme poverty is defined by the international community as earning less than $1.25 a day as measured in 2005 international prices. Originally, the international poverty line was set at earning $1 a day when the Millennium Development Goals were first published. However, in 2008, the World Bank pushed the line to $1.25 to recognize higher price levels in several developing countries than previously estimated. As of September 2010, according to the UN, roughly 1.2 billion people remain in extreme poverty based on this metric. Despite the significant number of individuals still earning below the international poverty line, this figure represents significant progress for the international community, as this number is 700 million fewer than the number living in extreme poverty in 1991.9 billion, is highlighted in the next section. Though there are many criticisms of a purely income-based approach to measuring extreme poverty, the $1.25 per day line remains the most widely used metric, as it is easily accessible to the public at large and draws attention to those in the direst need. On September 23, 2015, the UK-based Financial Times reported that the World Bank intends to revise its income-based benchmark upward to $1.90 a day. As a result, poverty numbers are likely to swell, according to the paper. Common criticism. Alternatives. Though widely used by most international organizations, the $1.25 per day extreme poverty line has come under scrutiny from a variety of actors. For example, when used to measure headcount ratio, the $1.25 per day line is unable to capture other important measures such as depth of poverty, relative poverty and how people view their own financial situation. Moreover, the calculation of the poverty line relies on several debatable assumptions about purchasing power parity, homogeneity of household size and makeup, and consumer prices used to determine a basket of essential goods, not to mention the fact that there may be missing data from the poorest and most fragile countries which may muddle the picture even further. To address these problems, Several alternative instruments for measuring extreme poverty have been suggested which incorporate other factors such as malnutrition and lack of access to a basic education. Thus, the 2010 Human Development Report introduced the Multidimensional Poverty Index, which measures not only income, but also basic needs. Using this tool, the United Nations Development Programme estimated that roughly 1.5 billion people remained in extreme poverty as opposed to the conventional figure of 1.2 billion. As this figure is considered more holistic, it may shed new light on relative deprivation within a country. For example, in Ethiopia, 39% of the population is considered extremely poor under conventional measures, but 90% are in multidimensional poverty. Another version of the MPI, known as the Alka-Foster method, created by Sabina Alka and James Foster of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, can be broken down to reflect both the incidence and the intensity of poverty. This tool is useful as development officials, using the MO measure of the method, can determine the most likely causes of poverty within a region. For example, in the Gaza Strip of Palestine, using the MO measure of the Alka-Foster method reveals that poverty in the region is primarily caused by a lack of access to electricity and drinking water, in addition to widespread overcrowding. In contrast, data from the Chakra district of Bhutan reveals that income is a much larger contributor to poverty as opposed to other dimensions within the region. Current trends. Getting to zero. Using the World Bank definition of $1.25 per day, as of September 2013, roughly 1.2 billion people remain in extreme poverty. Nearly half live in India and China, with more than 85% living in just 20 countries. Since the mid-1990s, there has been a steady decline in both the worldwide poverty rate and the total number of extreme poor. In 1990, the percentage of the global population living in extreme poverty was 43.1%, but in 2010, the percentage had dropped down to 20.6%. This halving of the extreme poverty rate falls in line with the first Millennium Development Goal proposed by former UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan, who called on the international community at the turn of the century to halve the proportion of people living in extreme poverty by 2015. This reduction in extreme poverty took place most notably in China, Indonesia, India, Pakistan and Vietnam. These 5 countries accounted for the alleviation of 715 million people out of extreme poverty between 1990 and 2010, more than the global net total of roughly 700 million. This statistical oddity can be explained by the fact that the number of people living in extreme poverty in Sub-Saharan Africa rose from 290 million to 414 million over the same period. However, there have been many positive signs for extensive global poverty reduction as well. Since 1999, the total number of extreme poor has declined by 50 million per year on average. Moreover, in 2005, for the first time in recorded history, poverty rates began to fall in every region of the world, including Africa. Although this is largely due to a change in the 2000 UN Millennium Declaration, extending the planned period backward to 1990. It was previously 1996. Changing the date took advantage of rapid population growth and a huge poverty reduction in China during the 1990s. As aforementioned, the number of people living in extreme poverty has reduced from 1.9 billion to 1.2 billion over the span of the last 20 to 25 years. If we remain on our current trajectory, many economists predict we could reach global zero by 2030. 2030 to 2035, thus ending extreme poverty. Global Zero entails a world in which fewer than 3% of the global population lives in extreme poverty. This zero figure is set at 3% in recognition of the fact that some amount of frictional poverty will continue to exist, whether it is caused by political conflict or unexpected economic fluctuations, at least for the foreseeable future. However, the Brookings Institution notes that any projection about poverty more than a few years into the future runs the risk of being highly uncertain. This is because changes in consumption and distribution throughout the developing world over the next 2 decades could result in monumental shifts in global poverty, for better or worse. Others are more pessimistic about this possibility, with many predicting a range of 193 million to 660 million people living in extreme poverty by 2035. Additionally, some believe the rate of poverty reduction will slow down in the developing world, especially in Africa, and as such it will take closer to 5 decades to reach global zero. Despite these reservations, several prominent international and national organizations, including the UN, the World Bank and the United States federal government, have set a target of reaching global zero by the end of 2030. Exacerbating factors. There are a variety of factors that may reinforce or instigate the existence of extreme poverty, such as weak institutions, cycles of violence and a low level of growth. Recent World Bank research shows that some countries can get caught in their fragility trap, in which the above factors prevent the poorest nations from emerging from low-level equilibrium in the long run. Moreover, most of the reduction in extreme poverty over the past 20 years has taken place in countries that have not experienced a civil conflict or have had governing institutions with a strong capacity to actually govern. Thus, to end extreme poverty, it is also important to focus on the interrelated problems of fragility and conflict. USAID defines fragility as a government's lack of both legitimacy and effectiveness, as fragile nations are unable to equitably and effectively perform the functions of a state. These countries are much more prone to violent unrest and mass inequality. Additionally, in countries with high levels of inequality, much higher growth rates are needed to reduce the rate of poverty when compared with other nations. Not to mention, after removing China and India from the equation, up to 70% of the world's poor live in fragile states by some definitions of fragility. Looking further, some analysts project extreme poverty will be increasingly concentrated in fragile, low-income states like Haiti, Yemen and the Central African Republic over the coming years. However, some academics, such as Andy Sumner, assert that extreme poverty will be increasingly found concentrated in middle-income countries, creating a poverty paradox, as the world's poor don't actually live in the poorest countries. Despite this debate, addressing the problem of fragility remains a very real issue. To help low-income, fragile states make the transition towards peace and prosperity, the New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States, endorsed by roughly 40 countries and multilateral institutions, was created in 2011. This New Deal represents an important step towards redressing the problem of fragility, as it was originally articulated by self-identified fragile states who called on the international community to not only do things differently, but to also do different things. On the other hand, civil conflict also remains a prime cause for the perpetuation of poverty throughout the developing world. Armed conflict can have severe effects on economic growth for a plethora of reasons. It destroys assets, creates unwanted mass migration, destroys livelihoods and diverts public resources towards war fighting. Significantly, a country that experienced major violence during 1981 to 2005 had extreme poverty rates 21 percentage points higher than a country with no violence. On average, a civil conflict will also cost a country roughly 30 years of GDP growth. Therefore, a renewed commitment from the international community to address the deteriorating situation in highly fragile states is necessary to both prevent the mass loss of life, but to also prevent the vicious cycle of extreme poverty. International conferences. Millennium Summit. On September 6–8, 2000, world leaders gathered at the Millennium Summit held in New York, launching the United Nations Millennium Project suggested by then UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan. Prior to the launch of the conference, the Office of Secretary-General Annan released a report entitled We the Peoples: The Role of the United Nations in the 21st Century. In this document, now widely known as the Millennium Report, Kofi Annan called on the international community to adopt the target of halving the proportion of people living in extreme poverty, and lifting more than 1 billion people out of it by 2015, citing studies that show an almost perfect correlation between growth and poverty reduction in poor countries. Annan urged international leaders to indiscriminately target the problem of extreme poverty across every region. In charge of managing the project was Jeffrey Sachs, a noted development economist, who in 2005 released a plan for action called Investing in Development, a practical plan to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. 2005 World Summit. The 2005 World Summit, held on September 14–16, was organized to measure international progress towards fulfilling the Millennium Development Goals. Notably, the conference brought together more than 170 heads of state. While world leaders at the summit were encouraged by the reduction of poverty in some nations, they were concerned by the uneven decline of poverty within and among different regions of the globe. However, at the end of the summit, the conference attendees reaffirmed the UN's commitment to achieve the MDGs by 2015 and urged all supranational, national and non-governmental organizations to follow suit. Post-2015 Development Agenda. With the expiration of the Millennium Development Goals approaching in 2015, the international community is focused on accelerating efforts to achieve the goals laid out in the original MDGs. Overall, there has been significant progress towards reducing extreme poverty, with the MDG 1 target of reducing extreme poverty rates by half, met 5 years ahead of the 2015 deadline. 0.700 million fewer people lived in conditions of extreme poverty in 2010 than in 1990. However, at the global level 1.2 billion people still living in extreme poverty. One notable exception to this trend was in Sub-Saharan Africa, the only region where the number of people living in extreme poverty rose from 290 million in 1990 to 414 million in 2010, comprising more than a third of those living in extreme poverty worldwide. With the aforementioned in mind, the UN convened a high-level panel of eminent persons to advise on a post-2015 development agenda. The HLP report, entitled A New Global Partnership to Eradicate Poverty and Transform Economies Through Sustainable Development, was published in May 2013. In the report the HLP wrote that ending extreme poverty is just the beginning, not the end. It is vital, but our vision must be broader, to start countries on the path of sustainable development, building on the foundations established by the 2012 UN Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio de Janeiro 12, and meeting a challenge that no country, developed or developing, has met so far. We recommend to the Secretary-General that deliberations on a new development agenda must be guided by the vision of eradicating extreme poverty, once and for all, in the context of sustainable development. Thus, the report determined that a central goal of the post-Millennium Development Agenda is to eradicate extreme poverty by 2030. However, the report also emphasized that the MDGs were not enough, as they did not focus on the devastating effects of conflict and violence on development, the importance to development of good governance and institution, nor the need for inclusive growth. Consequently, there now exists synergy between the policy position papers put forward by the United States, the World Bank and the UN itself in terms of viewing fragility and a lack of good governance as exacerbating extreme poverty. However, in a departure from the views of other organizations, the Commission also proposed that the UN focus not only on extreme poverty, but also on a higher target, such as $2. The report notes this change could be made to reflect the fact that escaping extreme poverty is only a start. In addition to the UN, a host of other supranational and national actors such as the European Union and the African Union have published their own positions or recommendations on what should be incorporated in the post-2015 agenda. The European Commission's communication, published in A Decent Life for All, From Vision to Collective Action, affirmed the UN's commitment to eradicate extreme poverty in our lifetime and put the world on a sustainable path to ensure a decent life for all. By 2030, a unique vision of the report was the Commission's environmental focus. Specifically, the Commission argued long-term poverty reduction requires inclusive and sustainable growth. Growth should create decent jobs, take place with resource efficiency and within planetary boundaries, and should support efforts to mitigate climate change. The African Union's report, entitled Common African Position on the Post-2015 Development Agenda, likewise encouraged the international community to focus on eradicating the twin problems of poverty and exclusion in our lifetime. Moreover, the CAP pledged that it would commit to ensure that no person, regardless of ethnicity, gender, geography, disability, race or other status, is denied universal human rights and basic economic opportunities. UNLDC conferences. The UN Least Developed Country Conferences were a series of summits organized by the UN over the past few decades, which sought to promote the substantial and even development of so-called Third World countries. First UNLDC Conference, held between September 1 and September 14, 1981, in Paris. The first UNLDC conference was organized to finalize the UN's substantial new program of action for the 1980s in least developed countries. This program, which was unanimously adopted by the conference attendees, argued for internal reforms in LDCs to be complemented by strong international measures. However, despite the major economic and policy reforms initiated many of these LDCs, in addition to strong international aid, the economic situation of these countries worsened as a whole in the 1980s. This prompted the organization of a second UNLDC conference almost a decade later. Second UNLDC Conference, held between September 3 and September 14, 1990, once again in Paris. The second UNLDC conference was convened to measure the progress made by the LDCs towards fulfilling the development goals during the 1980s, recognizing the problems that plagued the LDCs over the past decade. The conference formulated a new set of national and international policies to accelerate the growth rates of the poorest nations. These new principles were embodied in the Paris Declaration and Programme of Action for the Least Developed Countries for the 1990s. Fourth UNLDC Conference. The most recent conference, held in May 2011 in Istanbul, recognized that the nature of development had fundamentally changed since the first conference held almost 30 years earlier. In the 21st century, the capital flow into emerging economies has increasingly become dominated by foreign direct investment and remittances, as opposed to bilateral and multilateral assistance. Moreover, since the 80s, significant structural changes have taken place on the international stage, with the creation of the G20 conference of the largest economic powers, including many nations in the global south. Formerly undeveloped nations are now able to have a much larger say in international relations. Furthermore, the conference recognized that in the midst of a deep global recession, coupled with multiple crises, the international community would have fewer resources to aid the LDCs. Thus, the UN considered the participation of a wide range of stakeholders crucial to the formulation of the conference.